So thank you everybody for joining. I'm Grant Paling. I'm the service area owner for our detect and respond services within Orange Cyber Defense. So I work in our global service lines team and our product management function. The title of my presentation today is called Turning Managed Detection and Response Inside Out. And as you'll see, in keeping with the kind of climate of cybersecurity theme that we have going on within this event, I have a bit of a background there that represents that. And I thought it was quite appropriate to show this kind of volcanic eruption. You know, what I see when we're looking at providing managed detection and response services for our customers, you know, is often this kind of sudden visibility of events that were happening, almost things that were bubbling beneath the surface, waiting to erupt, but that were unseen. So I thought quite an appropriate visualization there, and I'll be linking back to that theme as we go through. So what am I going to cover in the agenda today? I'm going to play with this concept and this title of turning managed detection and response inside out. The first thing I'm going to talk about is turning inside out from just getting into the nuts and bolts of how we've evolved from these early notions of the managed security operations center and how that's changed. So really kind of playing with the concept and exploring, you know, what we all, I think, understand by managed detection and response. Then turning it inside out from a different perspective, and this is quite literally looking from the inside out and looking at how, you know, the expanding attack surface we have as organizations now forces us to look outwards of our own organization as well as looking inwards, which we've typically focused on in the past as businesses. And then finally, the final notion of turning, you know, MDR inside out is looking beyond the inside and what visibility we can get outside and how there are perhaps things that we haven't thought about when we think of managed detection and response. So the first thing is to look at the evolution of MDR as a concept. And really the most common request I see still today from our customers who approach us about this subject is, you know, this phrase, we would like a managed CM or a SOC service. You know, it used to be the same thing. It was just kind of this combination of two things. You know, they're all part of this package. Now I would say that's not necessarily the case. And what does that mean? Does that mean that the concept of SIM and central log correlation is dead? No, I don't think so. I just think maybe that its position changed somewhat, and that we start to consider now that we have different approaches within how we approach internal threat detection. There are different strengths and weaknesses, and there's this concept of the SOC triad that has, you know, been around for a while now. That, you know, yes, log-based detection is one way to understand security events that are happening within our environment, and it's still a very good place to do customization. Still a good place to collect a very diverse set of data, but not everything is logged, or not everything has a good set of logging, and it also takes some time often to set up in comparison to some of the other approaches that we have. When we think about something that is very quick to set up, something that is you know, a good base coverage, then I think we think of endpoint detection and response more and more these days. And really, where you can install an agent, it really does give you the best levels of visibility, but perhaps, you know, doesn't give you that coverage on threats present on devices without an agent that are present on our, you know, signs that are threats present on our network, and also within perhaps some of the services that we are connecting to now, as we move to more of a cloud and SaaS-based model within most businesses. And then finally, network-based detection, you know, a really good way to find coverage across all network-connected devices, whether we own them or not. But, you know, perhaps less visibility on activities that happen within an endpoint. So perhaps a good place to start an investigation. And this concept isn't new. It's been around for 5 years, going on since the first real kind of blog was written on it by Anton Shuarkin when he was at Gartner. And, you know, it's an evolving concept, but, you know, it's not new, and yet really it's only just really starting to be implemented, I would say, by many businesses. So what's changed? What's caused that? I think first of all, the threat model has changed, and particularly since the start of the COVID pandemic, that's really had a big effect on the threat model for pretty much every business. Alongside that, endpoint detection and response got good. It's vastly improved over the last 5 years. MITRE ATT&CK has also come in as a way to perhaps, be a measurement tool for some of these, for deploying some of these types of visibility or capabilities to give us visibility. And then network detection and response was born as well. That's really come into it as that third pillar and really become a stronger third part of the SOC triad concept. So on that first point of the threat model, we kind of saw this coming, this shift. Certainly a lack of focus on the endpoint in particular was something that we were talking about before COVID, and certainly since the impact of more remote working, more working from home, with across the businesses that we work with. We'd done a piece of research that I was talking about in a conference that was literally a month before the first lockdown happened here in the UK, and it was really around a piece of research that we'd done around the inherent insecurity of VPN technologies. This kind of faith that we placed in them. A lot, the research included looking at things like captive portal situations, guest Wi-Fi, and this kind of lag of time between when we're connecting effectively to these access points and when we're safely connected to the VPN. Never mind how much safety that actually gives us. There's a full piece of research you can read. Please contact me afterwards using the details we got if you're interested in reading that. I think that was one of the things we were looking at the time. And of course, if we move on to now and where we all are, the endpoint is very much the target. It's somewhere where attackers can gain direct access to user data. So it's very attractive for attackers. And also, this concept of the endpoint is the user now. You have access then to the inherited privileges that those users have on other systems, access to credentials that they might have, and the privileges that they may have on systems, as well as direct access to all sorts of other pieces of information about the user. Not just the user themselves, though, it's a foothold. And the next stage of most attacks, once you have that foothold, is to look at lateral movement. Where else can we get to? And again, this is where the endpoint can be pivotal for looking at the kind of expansion of attacks as they happen and as they unfold. But the excessive event data, that it's always been a problem of endpoint detection and response tools. The amount of data that is produced. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail in a second. And just to finish on this point, the endpoint, we see as a soft target. It's a big target. It's at the center of the endpoint, as we mentioned, is the user, and user behavior really is still something that we can't solve. It's unpredictable. It creates weaknesses inherently. No matter how much we educate our users, there will always be a set of users that are susceptible to being exploited by cyber criminals. And of course, more and more now they are directly accessing the internet from their homes. So definitely there is a bigger risk there than there was, I think, we see. So back onto this problem of too much data. If we agree that the endpoint is a good place to pick up valuable information about threats, how do we consume that data and how do we manage the amount of data that we get there? And the first approach involves, the traditional approach we've seen involves a very flat data model. Data that requires a lot more manual analysis because it's very endpoint centric, not enterprise centric. And what I mean by that is, we're looking at a set of alerts that relate to a single endpoint. So even if you can have a very nice attack tree, I'm sure many of you would have seen demonstrations of endpoint detection and response tools, how you can see, the actions that unfold at a deep kind of endpoint forensics level. But being able to correlate that data across all of the endpoints that exist across your enterprise, I think is the tough bit. And that's where you really need more of a dynamic data model behind this. This concept that everything is connected to everything. Every action that the user takes, every process that starts on their machine, every file that they open, who else is doing that on their endpoint? Because that's what we also want to know. We want to look at this in the context of an attack, not necessarily in the context of a single alert. And that's really how we move away from this very singular alert-based model to more of an asset-based model, or even to a cross-enterprise incident-based model. We need to aggregate the whole attack. We need to understand what's all the affected machines of that attack, not considering, let's say, if there was an outbreak across 200 endpoints and we get 200 alerts, if they're all part of the same attack, we want to know that. And only by having more of a dynamic data model can we do that. And one of the byproducts of that is also, if we have that ability to create these interrelationships via a data model that supports that, is very fast query results. It's a shorter time to be able to understand what is actually happening, less alerts to deal with, and the full scope of an incident. So we're very focused on generating alerts, I think, over the past. And I think when we talk about turning managed detection and response inside out, to really shift from that alert-based structure that we've all been so obsessed with creating alerts, actually, I think the focus now is on dealing with those alerts. And the only way to realistically deal with the masses of alerts that we get from a lot of security technologies is to have smarter data models that allow us to handle that. The next thing is that I mentioned, the big change in managed detection and response is mapping coverage. I think, the advances with things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework have been excellent for the industry to have a benchmark against which to look at how we are covered against different threats. And actually being able to map that and map yourself as an organization against that. That's something we've certainly taken to heart. You'll see a screenshot on this slide from our SIM-based detection application that we display for customers. And one of the things we've done with that is to display where we're covering MITRE ATT&CK techniques. So you'll see the green ones as the ones that are covered for this particular sample customer, and then the ones in grey are those that are not currently covered. So it's a way to see what we are able to detect, but also more importantly what we're missing and where we have room to develop and grow. And I think it's very important. This is always a journey. You never have. I think there may be this false sense of security in implementing a managed detection and response service that problem solved. It's certainly not the case. I think it's important in the selection of a provider in this space, if it's an area that you're looking at, is to understand how you're going to move through that journey, how you're going to have that continuous development. And that's something that certainly myself and the team that are working on our service propositions have really thought about and tried to make that as easy as possible. And finally, NDR, Network Detection and Response. We finally settled on a name for this. It's been called Network Traffic Analytics. It's been called Network Forensics over the years, even in Anton Chuvakin's original SOC triad. I think it was referred to as Network Forensics. Perhaps makes more sense to sit alongside EDR as NDR. So Network Detection and Response. And again, there are certainly gaps that this particular area covers. We're going to come on to maybe some examples later on, actually, of this, and network detection and response technologies and the machine learning capabilities that they are using are actually starting to expand beyond traditional networks now, and I think that's they're expanding into the gaps that the endpoint doesn't cover, and that it's difficult to do with log-based detection. So I think again, what I'm trying to unpick here is all of these approaches are valid, they're all valuable, and they're a vital part of how we do detection and response as businesses. And similarly to, at the endpoint where antivirus has been almost bypassed by these next generation antivirus and now endpoint detection and response capabilities as well. Similarly on the network, you had intrusion detection that's been around for a very long time. But really, that has reached a point, I think, where it is very focused in point in time. It's very difficult to get away from that kind of short-lived reactive intelligence around how a threat looks, threats we've seen before, and a snapshot in time. And when you're talking about intrusion detection or indeed intrusion prevention systems, you're really having to make that decision at any point in time. Do we block this network traffic or not? Where actually, network traffic is much more suited to a data science approach, where we have this long-lived predictive intelligence, where we can introduce some local context. We can let the network monitoring devices or software sit within our networks and learn not just the patterns of traffic that match what we've seen from a research point of view that suggest attacker behaviors and intrusions, but also how that sits alongside normal behavior for a network. So it's kind of this combination of the old time kind of network baselining solutions that used to exist years ago that they didn't quite work because they only had that local perspective, and the intrusion detection systems that have this kind of global perspective. So putting those two approaches together into what we now call network detection and response is again a real evolution here that we've seen particularly accelerate over the past couple of years. From a network side, though, it's not as simple as it used to be. It was nice when we could just plug these devices into our physical networks in our data centers. How does that work in the new world, in the world of public cloud and those networks that we are standing up that now sit outside of our control, that we can't just plug in physically? Well, the good news is that there is cloud native detection built into a lot of these approaches. So Vectra AI, for example, the technology that we work with in our managed detection and response service, has this plug-in to things like VPC traffic mirroring, which is the ability to tap network traffic directly from AWS. And also there's capabilities with virtual tapping technologies in an Azure environment as well. So we do see that there is that capability there. So just because the network's changing doesn't mean we can't still use network-based detection as a technique. So at the end of that first section, this kind of eruption of visibility, or this potential eruption, we want to understand what we're getting ourselves into. When the smoke clears, what do you do? How do you decide where to start with network detection, with endpoint detection, with log-based detection? And the good news is you're not alone on that front. We are here to help. There are a couple of resources that I'm going to share with you now that are hopefully will be useful. The first one is something we launched recently, which is very simply an MDR buyer's guide, which is an online resource that allows you to go through a short questionnaire to understand, fill in a few questions about the profile of your business and understand potentially, what might be a good place to start. That is no substitute, of course, for talking to us and talking with our consultants that are knowledgeable around the subject, and we have specialists in all around the world within Orange Cyber Defense to talk to about this. So please don't be afraid to lean on them as well. And the second thing that we have that is very useful to many of our customers is what we call the threat detection framework. We developed this really to help customers to understand the coverage of our services, and not just general coverage, but the coverage that they would receive in their environment. I think that's a very important distinction. It's very easy for most, I think what you see from a lot of managed detection and response providers is this concept that by the service, it will cover all of these MITRE attack techniques, it will cover all of these areas of visibility. When actually, some of the factors that control that are your environment. From a log-based detection point of view, for example, we are dependent on the logs that can be provided. What is there? What information do we have access to? When we look at network-based detection, we're looking at the types of traffic that we can tap and at which point. and from an endpoint point of view, it's a question of how many endpoints we can actually install an agent on. So there are these different variables. You'll see some screenshots here of the threat detection framework as I'm cycling through that kind of illustrate this point. So yeah, this is something we can run through with you. It's a dynamic web application that we've created to help model, first of all, understand what's your objective. Every business will have different objectives in terms of threat detection and how far they want to go, how far they should go based on the threat model and the adversaries that they might be facing. Not all of us are going to be attacked by nation state actors. And then also, the limitations perhaps of budgets and also keeping control on not trying to fix everything at once. It's quite impossible to do this big bang approach of suddenly, again, turning on multiple technologies and implementing these services, and suddenly you have all the visibility in the world. So working more in a phased approach, modeling throughout and increasing over time your security detection capabilities and maturity. So is it enough to implement the SOC triad? And that's the question I think that then brings me on to the next point. When we're thinking about turning managed detection and response inside out, the second section here is really about turning our gaze outwards. Again, keeping with the climate change theme, I think we're seeing the climate of our own IT infrastructures change drastically, much like the polar bear on the piece of ice here. We're seeing the ice shrinking, that ice potentially being our own data centers, and just drifting out into the sea of the cloud environments that we have ahead of us. So we have to look now to be able to control much more than we ever had to before, much more complexity, many more variables. We've talked about so far, we talked about on-premises resources, we talked about devices, we've talked a little bit about cloud and SaaS applications. And yet we really must consider new attack surfaces. So we need to consider all of these different attack vectors now, this kind of digital footprint that we are starting to grow as businesses, and it continues to expand. One thing's for sure, and that's identity is key. I think that's the one thing that hasn't changed. But certainly the importance of monitoring identity and the use of identity has and become ever more important. Multi-cloud and SaaS integration is key. And this is where it really does go beyond the endpoint being this focal point. The endpoint is a good place to start, but we need to be able to see inside what's happening in these cloud environments, inside applications, inside software as a service interactions that we have. So that's really key. And of course, it wouldn't be prudent not to mention the Microsoft footprint. It's growing, not shrinking. Certainly, they've had an impact in security, more than ever before in terms of the number of capabilities they're bringing out, and also bundling into a lot of the enterprise agreements now that many businesses obviously have access to. So that's something we need to consider and make the most out of. And yet, use case development has always been a fundamental of doing security monitoring correctly, and this has not really changed. I think what hasn't really changed, but perhaps has been a thing that I think many companies have lacked focus on, is where we always start with is understanding the current threats. Security intelligence should drive our thought process when it comes to what to monitor. So we've talked a lot so far about how to monitor and how to get visibility. The next thing to understand is what. And very much, from an Orange Cyber Defense point of view, we're very much coming from an intelligence-led security perspective. There is a much deeper session with my colleagues, Charles and Stefan. Go and check that out for much more depth on this topic. But I'm going to touch on it for a second. And there's this quote by Sun Tzu, from The Art of War, a very famous book. Know thyself and know thy enemy, and knowing your adversary within cybersecurity, and certainly for somebody like ourselves who is looking to protect many different companies of all industries and sizes and maturity, it's very important to know the adversary within that, to understand the landscape, to anticipate the attacks that are going to happen, because often we are charged with being that first line of defense for customers, and also looking to understand, being there for them, to rely on us to detect the things that they couldn't with whatever security measures that they have in place. But it's also very important to know yourself, to know your own assets and attack surface. And I think traditionally this has been something that organizations have self-admittedly been very bad at. And also to then, detect vulnerabilities and active attacks. Two fundamental things that are inherently linked. These are the basics that still we see are not being done perfectly by many organizations. So still the things to focus on. And when we look at intelligence-led security, this kind of ecosystem should be that intelligence should be flowing back and forth, both between these different initiatives. The understanding of the adversaries should feed into our ability to identify, protect, detect, and respond to threats. But equally, in actively responding and detecting threats, we should feed back into that ability to anticipate. So, one of the concepts we have is the OCD, the Orange Cyber Defense Intelligence Backbone, and that is really all about this cyclical, this input output, where our various teams and our various services that we deliver are all plugging into our intelligence backbone. This huge amount of data that we have access to through, being an intelligence-led company, through doing security research, and that comes in very different forms, from the people out there researching vulnerabilities within our CERT teams, the people that are doing research into breaking systems, our ethical hacking group. There's a big focus on research within that team as well, which is invaluable to our defenders. So all of these inputs, also produce often outputs that feed back into that intelligence backbone. So if we see, detections and indicators of compromise at one customer, in investigating that incident, of course, we might pick up other indicators of compromise that we can feed back in that might be present at other customers, these observations. And also through our CSERT team on the ground, the incident response cases in particular can provide some very, very good intelligence about what's happening, particularly when it comes to, innovative techniques that have been used to circumvent our clients' defenses to the point where it's caused a major security incident. So working through this concept, understanding the threats, once we've done that, of course, we can build the technical analysis and work with our customers to understand how those threats relate to their specific environment. And that's where understanding that environment comes in, understanding that attack surface. Only then can we start to threat model. And this is particularly important when it comes to cloud security. This idea that, we've done, the kind of traditional data center security, and now we're moving to the cloud. Let's do cloud security. Well, cloud just means so many things. And we really need to understand, yes, it's possible to tap various cloud infrastructures, to tap new security resources that we have in the cloud, new security technologies that are monitoring all sorts of aspects of cloud computing. But it all comes back to the business risk. If we're not addressing a business risk, then the monitoring that we're doing is for the sake of monitoring. We're going to produce alerts. We're not going to produce information with context that can form a real security incident. So only once we've identified those threats that relate to an environment can we look to identify those threats. And that's where we can look at how we can monitor those threats. Can we do it through log-based detection? Can we do it through network-based or endpoint-based detection? Now, it's not a decision to be taken lightly. Yes, there are some of the basics. So implementing any of those approaches will fulfill some basic requirements that will allow you to get started. But as you grow on this journey, you then need to understand, well, what are we missing? And specifically, often that is the very much more business specific risks that we face. And I think we have to be more agile on that. This concept of detection code, I think we need to have a framework in place, and that's one of the things that we have created, particularly around log-based detection, is have a data model in place that supports agility. You have a lot of platforms now that are very reliant on these machine learning models that they've built, but then they're not very flexible. They will detect a lot of standard threats out of the box, but when it comes to customization, and this is one of the most important things to get real value out of managed detection and response, is that customization. And for that, we need to adopt more of an agile approach. We need to be able to say, we will be able to observe something and react to those threats, or proactively anticipate threats that might happen, and to be able to implement that as code. This is the taking a very much a DevOps type approach to managed detection and response, and that's really where this is going, and that where we have to be able to keep up with, especially when we move into these external cloud environments. So we have to have the agility that supports the agility of the business. Otherwise, that agility that is gained is not kept up with from a security point of view. So some examples of extending visibility into the cloud. I'm going to pick two areas that I wanted to cover with this. The first one is a common one. I would say, one of the most common things we get called into from an incident response scenario with our CSIRT team is Office 365 compromise. And, again, one of the impacts of the COVID pandemic is the acceleration of some of the projects, many Office 365 migration projects, out of necessity. But even before that trend, we saw a lot of Office 365 migrations where security just hadn't been built in from the start. And it's so valuable to do proper Office 365 monitoring. We've seen a number of breaches that started with an Office 365 account compromise, and it's something that is built in. So again, Vectra, on the network detection monitoring side, some of the machine learning models that have been built to assess network behavior can also be applied to Office 365 and this kind of more of an account-based view of things. Understanding, brute force attacks, failed attempts, and starting to think, well, this is unusual. But also building up that picture before we start to alert of what else is happening, what's going to happen next. And if we then see, suspicious sign-ons that are quite normal, but related to perhaps unusual user agent and authentication methods for this particular account, again, this is where that local context comes into play. And then followed by things like risky exchange operations. Now we start to really push the threshold of the machine learning model towards, okay, this is something critical now. Risky exchange operations. So things like rules set up to delete. We've seen things like exchange rules set up to delete password or emails containing the word password and things like that. So that any kind of warning signs that the end user might get from somebody compromising their account, the attacker's actually gone in and set up rules so that they never get those warnings. Very, very, very smart thing. Very easy to do once they have that access. And then things like mail forwarding, creating external forwarding rules. That's really going to be telling us that something unusual is going on here. So there are ways to detect this. There are ways to detect this quite easily. So again, that's more of an example of quick wins, but something that is we're seeing time and time again is not being considered. Also, on the kind of related to a cloud-centric view, but putting a different spin on it, is how else are we accessing those resources? And coming back to the endpoint side of things, of course, mobile is something that I think has been quite behind the curve when it comes to being considered along with traditional endpoints like laptops, desktops, servers in the past. And I think what we're starting to see now is the technology start to catch up on that when it comes to endpoint detection and response, and implement the abilities not just to protect mobiles. That's been around and improving for some time, but actually to bring that into the more of the endpoint detection and response view, to bring that into this cross-machine correlation, this enterprise-wide view of an attack, and bring mobiles into that equation. It's very exciting to have that come into the capabilities here, and indeed then be able to just bring that in as another source of data to identify malicious operations and incidents that might be happening, rather than treating the mobile as a silo, which we've had to do in the past. Technology hasn't been there, but that ability is coming in now. The ability to implement detection and response on mobile devices is here and now. So finally, going beyond the SOC triad, if we look at the final part around turning managed detection and response inside out, it's looking at the fourth pillar, if you like, the fourth wall, and breaking that down. What do I mean by that? I mean, we have to journey perhaps into uncharted waters that we previously haven't journeyed into with managed detection and response. And certainly, if you've been on this journey for some time, you've sorted the kind of SOC triad, or at least as much of it as you need to monitor your environment. You've got managed detection and response or detection and response capabilities in place. It's time now to look below the surface. And when I mean that, I mean the surface web. So this concept that of the SOC triad is there. It's very valuable, but really to break that and reshape it, I would say that we have to start thinking about adding to that monitoring of the open web, deep web, and dark web. Monitoring these outward-facing forces now that are part of our footprint. They are part of our organization. So part of that is, of course, the technologies the things that we own in the cloud, which was really what we focused on in the second section of this presentation. But moving here into this third part, I wanted to really focus on the things that we don't own but that still impact us. And for us, that means what we call managed cybercrime monitoring. That is the ability to monitor our brand, whether that's our footprint in the mobile, social, or on the web. In those landscapes, data exposure. Again, we may have DLP policies, data leakage prevention, inside our organization of the devices or the flows of data that we control. But what about extending that again outside? And often that's to do with accidental leakage by either your own employees or by a third party, which is often worse. So looking at data breaches, also fraud, things like domain monitoring for phishing websites that are impersonating your own, all of these fraudulent activities, the dark web monitoring that we've all been kind of told about, but maybe a lot of people don't really still understand what that is for a long time. That's really about monitoring for various types of attacks, not least, again, attempts at fraud, attempts at selling data and so on. But these things need to extend, they extend not just on the dark web, they're on the open web now. They are in these open cloud environments, maybe that haven't been locked down. So there's a lot of access to this information, and we need to bring that under our control as well. So all of these things are things that can be brought in to this managed detection and response sphere, or indeed, for people that are running their own internal services, you can bring in these types of data as well, and bring in a service to plug that gap, because this is something that is very specialist. It needs a certain set of infrastructure to do. And for us, this fits into, again, if we look at that anticipate, identify, and detect phases, that knowing yourself, this kind of visibility also lends itself to what we call managed targeted intelligence, the ability to provide our customers with information about targeted threats. So, for example, we look at the latest threats to the banking industry. as they're happening at the very cold face of it, to bring that data back to other customers who might not yet be affected, and help do that threat modeling piece to understand what's coming. So this is as much about that as this other monitoring as well, and the ability to respond as well. So that's the other piece to it. The ability to, for example, take down fraudulent domains very quickly, and attackers are very much capitalizing now on the fact that the hosting providers don't make this easy. They tend to target hosting providers who are perhaps a bit more lax in their policies. They're not really supportive of the businesses, or they just have a very strict policy around certain types of evidence that they need to take down domains. And attackers are getting very clever. We had an incident with a customer a few weeks ago where they were using a domain to deliver fraudulent phishing emails to third parties that were of our customers, so third party suppliers. But what they were also doing was, when you went to that domain, it redirected to the legitimate website, which meant that when the hosting provider looked at it from the surface of it, there was nothing going wrong there. It seemed perfectly legitimate. When actually that was just a distraction tactic, just to make it harder. We needed to provide very hard evidence of what was happening, and samples of these phishing emails before they would take it down. So the attackers are aware that we're doing this. We're trying to stop them, and they're trying to put as many hurdles in our way as possible. So just a quick case study, and this really, the point really of including this part is that this kind of cybercrime monitoring is not new, but it's been a silo for a long time, and it shouldn't be. During our monitoring of one of our managed detection and response customers, we discovered a suspicious domain that a user was connecting to. That domain actually was impersonating one of the other customers that we work with, that we also run managed detection and response services for. So they were basically, we had visibility, and this goes back to that kind of input and output around our intelligence backbone that I was talking about. So we were able to identify that. We informed our customer, for whom we were not running the domain monitoring service, somebody else was doing that. And it turned out that the domain monitoring service they were using, which again was siloed from what we were doing for them, had been flagged months ago as something that was infringing on their domain, but wasn't really doing anything. And this kind of raises 2 points. One, why weren't they tracking that domain? Because it was serving malicious content in the end. So they should have been tracking that domain to check periodically that of anything that was changing on that domain that might suggest it was going to be weaponized. Because guess what? Attackers don't always stand up their infrastructure and start serving threats straight away. They're smarter than that. And the second one is, having this visibility tied together allows us to really give that context, this inside-outside view, to understand if attacker infrastructure has been set up, is it being used to actively target our users, or those of other companies that might be out there that might be dealing with us. So I think that was a very good example of how these two things, they can't be separate anymore. They have to be brought together. We have to use the inside knowledge that we have alongside the outside knowledge. It's not good enough to just have inside visibility and outside visibility. So key takeaways from me. The first one is that managed detection and response is a journey, not a quick fix. I think, hopefully what you've taken from this, and what I would say echoes throughout Orange Cyber Defense and my colleagues that we're here to help with, is to help decide where you start on that journey, but also help you progress on that journey over a number of years. I think it's something that's much more variable than traditional managed services. So there are many ways to conduct detection and response as a function, and that should be considered. And it's going to be a unique story and a unique journey for every business. There is no one size fits all. There are many ways to do this. You have to find a way that's effective for you. I think it's essential that we start to incorporate the new threats posed by cloud initiatives, this expanding digital footprint that we have, and to make sure that we're making sure that we're ready in terms of understanding the new threats that causes, building that security intelligence knowledge that we have. But as businesses, our expectation on you, and I think things to take away from your sense should be, that threat modeling piece. What threats do they introduce? What is the business trying to do here, and therefore what might that be exploited for? How might attackers be looking at this as a way in, when, if and when they find a way in? And finally, digital risk management and cybercrime monitoring, that's absolutely part of this world too. It's not a separate thing. It does have some interaction perhaps with wider departments than just security. There is an impact to marketing activities, to legal from a fraud point of view, but it absolutely also should be part of our security monitoring operations. At that, I thank you for your attention. Hopefully that was useful. As I mentioned, a couple of the concepts that I talked about in this presentation are available in other presentations. So intelligence-led security from my colleagues Charles van der Walt and Stefan Lager. And also Gregory and Rodrigue will be talking more about cloud security, and in particular around the Microsoft stack. I recommend also looking at that and the other series of talks that we have. So thank you. If there are any questions, then my email address is there. Please feel free to get in touch. And thanks very much.